Emma-Jo Thomas bent her fat little body over her desk and looked across at Angie Bryson sitting 2 rows away. Her round, pink face plainly asked of Angie, "How do you like that?" And Angie, without so much as moving her lips, telegraphed back, "Grand." Some friendships are like that. Wordless, significant, all-embracing. Miss Clarkson, the music instructor, standing in front of the pupils, had just announced that the grades were to give an operetta some evening in the last week of June. It was a perfectly lovely operetta, Miss Clarkson was telling them in the vivacious voice that Emma-Jo sometimes thought too sugary. Miss Ray, the real teacher, now sitting over at her big desk, always talked to them in an ordinary way as though they were her own age. But Miss Clarkson, who came twice a week, made her voice gay and excited and a little babyish, unless she grew provoked at something, and then it sounded mad and natural. This afternoon, she was making it as sweet as a flute, and very enthusiastic. "There are several parts that will take a great deal of practice," she was saying. "Starring parts." Emma-Jo, gazing across at her chum again, distinctly saw Angie look self-conscious. It was a foregone conclusion that Angie would have one of those starring parts. She always did. There was not the slightest trace of envy in Emma-Jo's loyal heart, for Angie could sing in a clear, true voice, and, to Emma-Jo's uncritical mind, could act better than any of the 4 girls in Little Women. Miss Clarkson was saying that the operetta was called The Forest Child's Dream, which even more definitely settled matters in Emma-Jo's mind, for it followed that Angie would be either the forest child or the dream. There were to be squirrels and birds and flowers and butterflies, and it all sounded tremendously exciting to Emma-Jo and the other feminine listeners. But as usual, there was noticeable a more exasperating lethargy among the less deadly of the species. Not one of the boys seemed to be getting up any temperature over the potential impersonation of squirrels, birds, and butterflies. Miss Clarkson was working the girls into a perfect lather of anticipation, but the boys remained bored, as with a weary surfeiting of much participation in grand opera. Jimmy Landers even formed his lips and tongue into a realistic, if merely pantomimic, representation of the noisy offering known as the raspberry. And when Miss Clarkson said in a sprightly tone that someone was to be a funny, funny grasshopper and illustrated the jumping, Herman Stutz laughed out loud, but not mirthfully. It exasperated Miss Clarkson to such an extent she was moved to say that unless they exhibited a little more interest, she would not have one of the boys in it. Afterward, she told Miss Ray that statement would bring them around to a show of interest if she knew her applied psychology. But Miss Ray, who thought that applied psychology was nothing more or less than applied common sense, merely laughed and said that she never paid any attention to that unenthusiastic attitude, that it was a familiar masculine trait and employed merely as a mask. School having been dismissed with no more definite information on the future musical soiree, conversation by the Misses Bryson and Thomas, en route home, consisted largely of speculation over the coming event. A block down the street, their close communication was interrupted by the approach of old Mr. Mosby, the father of their own Mr. Mosby, the superintendent. Old Mr. Mosby had once been a college professor, but this last year he had lived in Huntsville with his son's family. He stopped now, leaning on his cane and looking down his long red nose. "Well, well," he said cheerfully, "here are the 2 little inseparables again, Rosalind and her Celia. Do you know who they were?" Emma-Jo volunteered the guess that they might be some of his relatives, but Mr. Mosby said no. They were friends in a play called As You Like It, written by Shakespeare. And did they know him? "My father does, I think," said Angie brightly, adding modestly that railroad conductors knew most everyone. "I do declare," chuckled Mr. Mosby. Emma-Jo was ashamed that Angie had said that, for somehow she had a feeling that the man was dead. People who had written books were usually dead, and at home there was a long row of books with this one's name on them. When Cousin Mel's little boy Georgie came to dinner, he had to sit on King Lear, but when the little Johnny came, it was also required the services of Hamlet to connect Johnny with his food. "Yes, you're like Rosalind and Celia." The old man was enjoying himself. The name sounded rather nice. Not long before, Angie and Emma-Jo had been Greta Garbo and Mae West, but their impersonations had ended so disastrously that they never mentioned the two now. The little girls were getting anxious to move on, but Mr. Mosby, with time hanging heavily on his hands, had more to say about Rosalind and Celia. In a voice like a radio announcer, he quoted, "We still have slept together, rose at an instant, learnt, played, eat together. And wheresoever we went, like Juno's swans, still we went coupled and inseparable." At that the two edged politely away, Angie muttering under her breath, "The old bore." But Emma-Jo rather liked it, especially the part about Juno's swans. She said it out loud several times, enjoying the way the syllables slipped over her tongue like cream pudding. To be sure, her personal interpretation was slightly original, inasmuch as she thought Juno was merely a poetic way of referring to the month of June. She even remembered it the next day when she looked across at Angie 2 rows away. The nice, gay month of June was here, with its roses and operetta. She and Angie were like that Rosalind and Celia. Her heart swelled with friendship for Angie. Angie was a swan. She was a swan. Juno's swans. But even as Emma-Jo was having her pleasant and rather poetical thoughts of friendship, even then the serpent was creeping into her Eden. For the door opened to admit Mr. Mosby, the superintendent, and a strange girl. All eyes, raised surreptitiously above books, were upon the two. Mr. Mosby was explaining something to Miss Ray, and Emma-Jo could hear part of the conversation. The new girl was the niece of Mrs. William Ryder. She was from Capital City, and she was to be in school for the rest of the term. Her parents had been called away east, and because she was obliged to come and stay with her aunt, she must finish her grade here. To say that the newcomer was pretty is a fractional truth. She was a vision. She was dashing. She had a tan-colored pleat skirt and a vivid green silk sweater, turned-down tan hose, tan and green sports shoes, and 2 green bracelets. Her hair was the fluffiest canary yellow bob. Her lips were bright red, her eyes large and blue. She stood at ease in front of the room and looked the pupils all over, tapping one sports shoe impatiently and biting her full red lips. Emma-Jo, in her excitement, telegraphed repeatedly to Angie, but Angie, gazing in fascination at the stranger, was not at the keyboard. When Mr. Mosby left, Miss Ray told the pupils that their new classmate's name was Faustina Farr. It kept running through Emma-Jo's mind like a song. Faustina Farr. It sounded frosty and sparkling and as pretty as Juno's swans. Faustina Farr, in spite of hailing from Capital City, did not recite noticeably better than the others, but she succeeded somehow in giving the impression that this whole thing called education was beneath her, and a little silly. At recess time, play on the feminine side of the grounds lagged noticeably. There seemed nothing to do but surround Faustina Farr in a consistently widening circle, from the equidistant center of which the newcomer told the perimeter of girls a great many interesting things of a statistical nature, largely about herself. She said there were as many pupils in her building in Capital City as in this whole 2x4 town. She said that she was asked to be in practically every entertainment there, that she had crooned in the Elks Club, and that she had been prevailed upon to broadcast torch songs from 3 different stations. She casually remarked that she had colored bracelets to go with every dress she owned, and admitted to owning many dresses. She offered gratuitously the following items: that her photograph had won a prize at an exhibit of pictures, that sometimes she was called a child prodigy, and that almost everyone thought she should be in the movies. Her last observation, as the bell rang, was concise, terse, and critical, namely, that she didn't know whatever she could do in this little stick town for several weeks. It depressed Emma-Jo. She looked up and down the streets where the pleasant old elms and maples met overhead and wondered what they could offer so rare a guest by way of entertainment. And then she remembered the operetta. But some presentiment of coming trouble must have possessed her, for as the girls turned reluctantly away from the charmer, she flung a plump little arm around Angie in vague motherly concern. When school was dismissed, Miss Faustina Farr cast her large blue orbs over the feminine contingent. In search of a companion en route home, she discarded all comers but Angie. and Angie, as fascinated as elated, went with her. But when Faustina asked Angie who the funny little fat person was trailing behind them, and Angie, with the same nonchalance a rooster might have used towards a worm, said, "Oh, that's just a neighbor of ours, Emma-Jo Thomas," the world and the solar system crashed around the funny fat little person. The second evening, after Faustina had laughed at everything Angie and Emma-Jo had once thought lovely, had burst into mirth at the thought of cutting out movie actresses and pasting them in a book, had gone into a mild form of hysteria over the idea of making jewelry out of flowers, nay, more, had been joined in this ribald outburst by Angie herself. Emma-Jo took her troubles to that source of all wisdom, her mother. Mrs. Thomas told a tearful little daughter that she was sorry for her, but not to care, that if that was all Angie's friendship had meant, it wasn't worth anything. She told her a great many other things, that friendship was like a sheltering tree, that real friends stick to one at all times, that she who cannot stay by a friend through all experiences is no friend at all. But Emma-Jo's stanch little heart did not move one iota against Angie, only against the serpent which had beguiled her. Faustina proved to be everything that stolid little Emma-Jo was not. She knew the latest slang. She knew the latest songs. She attracted masculinity. She could play the piano with dash, rather sketchily, to be sure, and with much blurring of chords. But for getting over the ground, there was not her equal in Huntsville. It all captivated the heart of Angie, so that wherever went Faustina Farr, there went Angie Bryson, and Emma-Jo trod the lonely path of exile. Old Mr. Mosby, meeting Emma-Jo one day on the street, asked what had become of the other little girl, and when Emma-Jo made an evasive answer, even he sensed something wrong. But after all, there was the operetta. Life, even in its darkest aspects, does not withdraw all its allurements. Operetta practice was on in full swing, and it was all and more than Miss Clarkson had so sportively predicted for it. Its authors had been most lavish in their presentation of characters. There were to be robins, butterflies, sparrows, a mockingbird, squirrels, a brown thrush, an old witch, goldenrod, a gardener, a cuckoo. Practically everything that ever grew, climbed, crept, ran, or flew in the forest was to be impersonated, except poison ivy and wood ticks. 5 of the leading parts fell to pupils in Miss Ray's room. Brown thrush proved to be Angie Bryson. Mockingbird was Faustina Farr. It might have been a matter for open debate as to why the talented ladies who wrote the operetta had placed a mockingbird in a pine and birch forest, but no doubt they were more musical than avifaunal. The gardener was Jimmy Landers. He who had once raised only raspberries was now to have a garden in the clearing. Cuckoo was Herman Stutz, who had once laughed without merriment, proving again that he who laughs first laughs last. And wonder of wonders, the old witch was none other than Emma-Jo Thomas in person. This dazzled Emma-Jo limitlessly, for she was the kind of child who seldom stars. All her young life she had been relegated to the back row of the chorus of daisies or made a member of the peasantry, and now she was to be the old witch with a tall pointed hat, a yellow cape, and a long crooked stick with which, like a ringmaster, she was to command all the inhabitants of the forest. She was almost ill with nervous excitement at the glory of it. Not once did she stop to think that her part was all talking. No solo work. For alas, Emma-Jo was no more musical than she was mathematical. That was a queer thing she could never tell anyone. She wished people knew how musical she felt inside her. She could hear lovely tunes in her head, but when she sang them, they were not quite recognizable. And lovely words were always repeating themselves over and over in her mind. To say Minnehaha, laughing water, made her flesh feel quivery, and by the shining big sea water stood the wigwam of Nokomis, made tears come to her eyes. She may have been dumb in arithmetic, but she leapt to meet her reading lessons as the tides leap to meet the moon. Poetry rippled over her like the curling waves of Lake Crystal at the picnic grounds. When Herman Stutz or Jimmy Landers read poems in their slow, halting way, it was as painful to her as piano discords to a musician. But now she had a great deal of talking to do, and it was all in poetry. At least Emma-Jo called it that, although Miss Ray was well aware that it would never have been chosen for an anthology. From that time on, Emma-Jo Thomas was a disciple of poesy. No longer did she talk as she had been wont to do. She became a sister to the goddess Thalia, her habitat Parnassus. Day after day she drank of the water that flows from Helicon's harmonious stream to the fountain of the muses. Because Angie no longer played with her, she made of her poetics a solitary game in her own backyard. With her long stick, an elm understudy to the hickory one at school, she would point and say in impromptu fashion, "Oh, lilac bush, I'll change you now into a lovely lady, and when you la, la 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 la, you'll find it nice and shady." At her mother's simple request to hand her the broom, the poetess would say, "Here is the broom that sweeps the dirt, and I will bring it to you. So sweep the porch and sweep the steps, and la, la la, la do you." "The operetta is making Emma-Jo poetical," her mother said. "The operetta is making Emma-Jo screwy," her father contributed. But if Emma-Jo had not known this new diversion, she would have been far more wretched than she was. Even so, she had periods of deepest little girl misery, for it is not pleasant to see one's twin swans sailing off with another. Every day at school was rehearsal day now. More and more was arithmetic shunted to the background. More and more did poetry come to the front. The sciences seemed to have decamped almost entirely in favor of the arts. The operetta became one's whole object in life. But all the time the forces that were later to be so disrupting were forming like cyclonic clouds on the horizon. To Emma-Jo, the music was lovely, especially one waltz song called The Summer Song. It made her feel like dancing whenever she heard the lilting tune. She could feel herself float about in exact time to it, but when she surreptitiously tried it, her fat little limbs refused to float. The spirit was willing, but that too solid flesh was weak. This delicious melody was the highlight of the operetta, and Miss Clarkson said it was to be sung either by brown thrush or mockingbird. It is easy to be seen that what happened then was distinctly the fault of the two composers who had collaborated on the operetta. For after all, it could not have occurred if they had just made up their minds which character was to sing the summer song, but they had left the decision poised in the air. To be sung either by brown thrush or mockingbird was plainly printed at the top of the page. Because Faustina Farr was mockingbird and Angie Bryson was brown thrush, it followed that the prettiest song of all was to be sung either by Angie Bryson or Faustina Farr. Faustina asked Miss Clarkson right before everyone if she could sing it. Such brazenness appalled even Angie, who was no modest violet. Miss Clarkson parried by saying in her twittery voice that she would have to confer with Miss Ray. Emma-Jo could plainly see that confer meant to argue. She tried not to listen. It was almost like reading a letter which did not belong to you. But from her front seat she could hear snatches of the conversation. She knew that Miss Clarkson was wanting Faustina. Something about the writers liking it. And just as distinctly she could hear Miss Ray say something about unfairness to regular pupils. Twice she heard her say very low, "So affected." Emma-Jo made a mental reservation to hunt up the word in the dictionary the moment she got home. She said it off and on out loud all the way there so she would not forget it. But inasmuch as there was a slight discrepancy between the word Miss Ray had used and the word affected, which Emma-Jo looked up, she found that it merely meant to be performed, accomplished, achieved, which, of course, was nothing against Faustina. But even so, each night Emma-Jo prayed consistently that Angie might be chosen. She and Angie might not be chums anymore, but friendship was a sheltering tree. So when Miss Clarkson said brown thrush, Angie was to sing the song, Emma-Jo, realizing the efficiency of prayer, turned her eyes guiltily from Faustina's angry countenance as one who had prayerfully maneuvered the whole thing. The operetta was to be on Thursday night. Miss Ray said that they were to come back to school on Friday morning, merely to get their books and promotion cards. Sometimes Emma-Jo caught her breath in the gripping fear that she would not be promoted, that the ogre, arithmetic, would hold her back with his clutching hands. But a glint of hope would invariably shine in the distance. After all, she always had been promoted. Some unseen force had seemed always to push her from class to class. It was as though those friends, reading, writing, and spelling, with whom she was on speaking terms, came to her aid each time and would not permit the ugly stranger, arithmetic, to harm her. But it was going to be terrible not to know the worst until Friday morning. Rehearsals went on. The last one was held on the big stage of the community building, where the voices sounded hollow and unnatural. The community building was new and smelled of plaster. The curtain was a huge velvet thing that ascended somewhere in the heights of heaven and hung suspended from the stars. It was interesting, even to Emma-Jo, but the little awe-stricken kindergartners, who were sparrows, could not take their fascinated eyes from the faraway spaces among the rafters, so that Miss Clarkson kept rapping for their attention. This last practice was called a dress rehearsal, and practically everything went wrong. The squirrels kept singing off-key. Angie failed to take the first notes of the waltz song with the orchestra. The gardener went on at first without his rake and, hurrying breathlessly back with it over his shoulder, raked off the blue jay's top knot and a goodly portion of scalp. The cuckoo, proving himself to be inordinately fond of cuckooing, had to be squelched vigorously and limited to a minimum output. A little sparrow, while gazing open-mouthed up to the vast space among the rafters, tripped over a fellow sparrow, which had the marvelous and mechanical effect of sending the whole row of little brown birds down like dominoes. It was all disheartening. Miss Clarkson was upset, nervous, and cross, and there was not the slightest warm twitter in her voice. Miss Ray was nervous, but not cross, merely caught in the spell of a great grim silence. It was as though she were saying, "Let fate do its worst. Nothing could be more terrible." Faustina snickered audibly and said in an undertone that the capital city teachers would have just died to see all this. Altogether, it made Emma-Jo feel a vast and awful responsibility, though she herself was letter perfect. At supper time, she sat down with the substantial food before her, all which she pretended to nibble because her mother was insisting. But it was sawdust on her protesting palate. She had a bath, she was dressed, and she was one of the first to arrive at the community building. In almost no time it was all noise and confusion behind the scenes. Miss Ray, pretty and smelling of apple orchards, made up the witch. When Emma-Jo turned her plump pink face up to her teacher so seriously, Miss Ray suddenly said, "Emma-Jo, it's a shame to make your sweet little face into an old witch." And then she did a very peculiar thing. She bent and placed a quick warm kiss on Emma-Jo's forehead, for quite suddenly it had occurred to Miss Ray that, after all, dumbness in arithmetic is a very slight evil in this world. She said, "Emma-Jo, you've been so nice in school all year. I'll hate to have you leave me." Emma-Jo's heart was bursting with happiness. That was the answer to the question about promotion. She was to go on. It didn't seem possible after all those wrong answers about if a train and if a farm. People were coming in. There was a constant noise of chairs and voices and shuffling feet. The denizens of the forest took turns in peeking around the edge of the curtain. Herman Stutz stuck out his head and cuckooed so often that by the time they were ready to begin, his own part of the program was virtually over. Emma-Jo caught a hurried glimpse of her mother and father, her brother Bob and his girl, Mr. and Mrs. Ryder, and old Mr. Mosby. It was going to be wonderful to show all these people how she could turn children into birds at the wave of her stick. Faustina laughed at the excitement of the others. She said you ought to be in a broadcasting station once if you think this little hick-town program was anything so hot. But she could not hurt Emma-Jo tonight. Something very queer hung over Emma-Jo. A sense of the unrealities of the everyday world, the realities of the play. It was not possible that they were from the families of Thomas, Bryson, Stutz, Landers, at all. It was the forest folk who were real. The spirit of the play was gripping Emma-Jo. If raindrops had fallen from the rafters high overhead or lightning flashed across the stage, it would not have surprised her. It was going to be a wonderful occasion, and the grandest part of all was to be that lovely waltz song of Angie's. Even if she and Angie were not chums anymore, she retained her old pride in Angie. The high school orchestra was playing Over the Waves. It may have been a little top-heavy as to brass, but to Emma-Jo it was the perfect symphony. Then Miss Clarkson was tapping her baton, which was the signal for the great heavy velvet curtains to lift. And there was Marian Reynolds sitting on the log in the forest saying, oh dear, I'm lonely here, in the forest by the hill." That was Emma-Jo's cue. Emma-Jo's heart was beating painfully. Her throat was so dry, she wondered if she could swallow. She walked into the forest with her stick, and a voice that seemed to come from far away mechanically said the very thing it should have said. "Ho, ho, my dear, it seems so queer that you should lonely be, with all the woods so full of friends for you to hear and see." Strangely enough, everything went off rather well. That unfortunate rehearsal was but a memory. The little girl saw all the things in the forest she should have seen, and left unseen all the things she should not have seen. The robins sang, so did the squirrels and the butterflies, and Emma-Jo commanded and changed things at the point of her stick so successfully that it gave her a sense of overwhelming superiority. It was nearing the end of the play now, time for the lovely summer song, the waltz song that Angie was to sing. Emma-Jo stepped back under the trees next to Faustina Mockingbird. And then the most terrible thing happened. Emma-Jo thought she was in a dream, an awful, breath-destroying nightmare. At the first orchestral note of the swinging melody, Faustina said in an undertone, "Watch me." Emma-Jo could not believe her eyes. Before the chords, which were to be Angie's cue to take her place, Faustina had gone forward to the edge of the platform and stood ready to sing the first notes of the song. Faustina Farr, in her grown-up crooning voice, was starting to sing Angie's lovely summer waltz song. No one in the Huntsville schools had ever done such a terrible thing, but Faustina Farr from Capital City had the nerve to do it. She was going away early the next morning and probably didn't care what happened. Emma-Jo could not look always at once at Miss Clarkson, who looked terribly surprised, but went on swaying her baton, at Miss Ray, whose face was redder than anything, at Angie, who had taken one step forward and then back, so she concentrated on Angie. Angie's face was red, too, and she looked ready to cry. Emma-Jo had seen Angie mad 100 times, but she couldn't remember seeing her look hurt. It was as though the iron statue of Mr. Hunt, who started the town, would have looked that way. All this, happening in the space of a moment or two, set Emma-Jo's mind working far faster than usual. Responsibility sat heavily upon her. She, the old witch, must do something for Angie. To understand what followed, one must delve into the realm of heredity. Emma-Jo's mother had been the coolest member of the neighborhood the time the Landers house caught fire. Suddenly, Emma-Jo was her mother. Emma-Jo's grandmother, left alone on the farm once, had stayed up all night in the barn because a horse thief was about. At this moment, Emma-Jo was her grandmother. Emma-Jo's great-grandmother had once torn away the mud chinking in her log cabin, thrust a rifle through the hole, and dared an Indian to come on. Just now, Emma-Jo was her great-grandmother. Stolid little Emma-Jo Thomas was suddenly all her courageous pioneer forebears. She was right. She was law. She was justice with her scales. She was truth forever on its throne. She could command all things in the forest. A great strength was upon her. She strode forward with her long, crooked stick. "Stop!" she said in a clear, high voice, so dictatorial that Faustina broke off on the syllable. Miss Clarkson's baton wavered. The orchestra died away on a lingering note. The audience, thinking it part of the operetta, sat unmoved. Had they not been seeing a small fat witch making sudden transformations all evening, just by swinging her stick? Little did they know history was being made. Emma-Jo in her short life had never made an extemporaneous speech before an audience. The chances were she never would again, but now she made one. Out from somewhere, for who can tell whence spring all the little lilting rhymes of the poet, came the words. Not for nothing had Emma-Jo Thomas conversed for weeks in verse. Thinking it out simultaneously with her speaking, she said, "Mockingbird, your song is heard, but brown thrush now must sing. Goodbye, farewell. Goodbye, farewell." There was a perceptible pause. Fate juggled poor little Emma-Jo Thomas in its cruel hand, but the muses had not forsaken their child. It came. "You must be on the wing." And miraculously, the thing was done. Emma-Jo Thomas's big moment was over. It was too much for Faustina. She had a bewildered, beaten look, as though her colossal nerve had at last deserted her. Miss Ray's face was as red as old Mr. Mosby's nose, and she might have been cast in bronze as amazement. Miss Clarkson also was the personification of perplexed surprise. All the birds and the flowers and the animals were wide-eyed with the peculiarity of the thing that they had just witnessed. Only the little brown sparrows, gazing in open-mouthed fascination into the vastness of the rafters high overhead, remained immune to any bewilderment over a change in the program. Faustina walked back under the trees. Angie, returning to normalcy, stepped out to her legitimate place on the stage. Miss Ray, cast in bronze, felt the blood start to flow again in her veins. Miss Clarkson's baton came up. The orchestra picked up the scattered notes of the waltz song. The little old witch slipped back to her place. Angie sang her song. Then the grand finale, with all the beasts and birds and flowers of the forest bursting into a wild revel of song, intoxicated with the thoughts that this was the last of the school year, the cuckoo adding a half-dozen raucous calls for good measure, and the operetta was over. Immediately all was confusion. Emma-Jo stood alone, dazed, all her recent strength gone from her like a cast-off garment. Stood there until Angie came flying through the milling crowd to throw both arms around her. "Emma-Jo, how could you do it? Oh, Emma-Jo, you're my friend, my best friend for all my life." But such affectionate emotion was not natural to Angie. Immediately she was saying, "That old Faustina, that old meanie, that old—" And then Faustina herself was coming by, her red silk coat over her arm. She tossed her yellow head, addressed Emma-Jo Thomas pointedly and without restraint. "You think you're smart, don't you? You little cluck of a fat hen." But Emma-Jo was wrapped in the warmth of Angie's arm and sustained by the glowering face of Angie turned Faustina Ward. And in that friendly shelter she knew she was not a fat hen, nor yet the cluck of a fat hen. She was a swan, a graceful swan, and so was Angie. Inseparable friends, like that Rosalind and Celia, twin swans in the lovely month of Juno.